My guest today is Judd Devermont, a former CIA intelligence analyst who rose to become the top Africa advisor to President Biden. We talk about Africa's past, present, and future, from coups and colonialism to the growing influence of China to the enormous economic and demographic power of the continent and why Africa's future is central to the world's. Judd was there for some of the most consequential decisions about U.S.-Africa policy, and his expertise is often relied on by those seeking to understand this vast and diverse land. It's a deep, fascinating conversation you don't want to miss. Judd, thanks so much for taking some time to come on the World and Stuff podcast. Really appreciate it. I think we're going to have an interesting discussion. I've been reading a little bit about your background and some of your recent writings and find it all very interesting. I first wanted to give people a little bit of an idea of how you got so interested in the African continent and became so intimately involved in Africa policy. You went to Yale and you studied Africa studies. You're a little bit older than me, so you were kind of like in college when 9/11 happened and all the focus turned to the Middle East. I guess I just wonder, why Africa? How did you become so interested?
Well, Drew, thanks first of all for having me here. I graduated college in 2001, in June of 2001. And so actually my first day in government as an intern in the Bureau of West African Affairs was on 9/11. So I was in Washington, D.C., having this experience. And like many Americans, so much anguish and anger and upset. But also, I felt a real sense of privilege that I could serve my government at that time. So that's just to pinpoint where I was at that moment. But my interest in Africa goes back a couple more years. I was a history major in college. It's all I've really loved is studying history. And you get out of high school and into college, and you can start taking things beyond U.S. history or European history. And I went gangbusters. I took classes all over the world and started to piece together the things that I was really passionate about, which is how do regions thrive when there are different geopolitical tensions or religious differences or ethnic differences? You know, what is the story of the agency of the local people? And that led me to Africa and decision to go study abroad in South Africa for a year. And honestly, I haven't looked back. I've been doing this since I was 19 years old. And every day I learned something new. And every day I remember something I forgot. And it's just a really gratifying career in a continent, in a region that is often misunderstood, but incredibly important to the future of our world.
We're going to get into your career and some of the different things you've done, but I wanted to get an idea of how much of Africa have you seen? Where have you lived, and how many of the countries have you traveled to?
Well, in sub-Saharan Africa, I'm at 40 of 49 countries. If you add a trip to Egypt and a trip to Morocco, I'm at 42 out of 54. So I'm working my way towards a set of steak knives. You know, I've got a couple island states I have to go to, some hard to reach places like Eritrea and Somalia, but I'm slowly but surely making my way to the complete set. I lived in South Africa, as I said, as a student. I went to the University of Cape Town. I actually came back there for my graduate work, which was on Indian-African relations in the 19th century. And then I had this opportunity to do an internship in Cote d'Ivoire. So I was at our embassy in Abidjan for about 6 months. And then further on in my career, I was posted in our embassy in Abuja, Nigeria. So those are the places where I've spent, more than just a couple weeks in. And of course, some of those countries I've spent maybe just 24 hours. In other countries, it's been longer because I went on vacation or I had longer work. There's a quote from A Hard Day's Night where they ask one of the characters, not one of the Beatles, but maybe like the uncle of someone, how was your trip? And he says, a room in a car, a room in a car, a room in a car. And so I have to admit that some of the places I've been to kind of look like that, and other places was really getting out of the capital, really meeting people, really getting a sense of the culture.
Obviously it's a huge continent. It's a million different places and languages and cultures. But I wonder just overall your feelings about the continent, maybe like your feelings of enchantment. What draws you in about it? What should people know more broadly about the continent and your feelings toward it?
Well, I'll start with my feelings, which is that I had a professor at the University of Cape Town who said history lies heavy on Africa. And that is true, and that's what drew me to it, and to have a life and a career where I'm trying to use my understanding of the continent's history and culture and politics to inform decisions. I can spend hours talking about African politics in the way some people may be talking about baseball games or football scores. It's endlessly complicated, endlessly interesting, the best story that you could ever tell, and it's very dynamic. I think what people need to understand about the continent, that it is extraordinarily diverse. And so at any moment when there can be a story that is heartbreaking about violence or disease or piracy or terrorism, there's also another place where cutting edge innovations are happening at the same time, right? We have mobile money because of innovations in Kenya with M-Pesa. And so that great diversity means that you can't just tell one single story about Africa, the continent, or even a region, and sometimes even a country. And to spend a career and a life trying to understand that complexity is quite rewarding. And then to take that a step further, and how does that fit into the questions and challenges we have today? How do the lessons of both success and failure, how can that drive a more durable international system or a more prosperous community of people, of nations? That's very exciting, and I think a lot of those answers lie in Africa.
I'm glad that you framed it that way, because Africa is so complex, and often what you hear about it is about violence and bad political leadership and all the issues that that are present. But I was there a few months ago in Uganda and found it to be a beautiful country full of all kinds of amazing things and problems, and it's complicated, and I am just an outsider trying to understand it. So I almost want to frame this entire podcast like that. Volumes and volumes of books are written about Africa. People should go read them and try to understand the complexities. And you could probably work your whole career and still only get the surface of it, because it's just so complex. But wanted to try to frame like modern Africa in some important historical events so people can maybe digest this conversation that we have later about some of the topics you are working on more easily. And, just going back and reading about some of the more significant modern events, I came to the Berlin Conference, and this is where 14 European powers in the United States in 1884 all meet. There's this rush to Africa. It's being colonized. They meet without any leaders from Africa to basically set the rules of engagement for how to divide and conquer Africa. I just wonder how important you think that is to understanding where we are today, is going back to colonialism and how it was carved up by the European powers.
Yeah, it's hugely important to understand the pre-colonial period and then the colonial period, and what are the legacies of that for the post-colonial period. And at the same time, which we'll get into, it's been 60 plus years, and how long you must always separate the structural constraints with decisions that are being made and who's responsible for that. But if there's one thing that I want people to get out of our conversation, is that Africa, shapes our past, present, and future. And so even before we talk about the Berlin Conference, I want people to know that African empires, city-states, communities, people were trading with the rest of the world. There's this story of an emperor named Mansa Musa of the Malian Empire. It's not exactly contiguous with the state of Mali. And he goes on a Hajj, and he brings all this gold with him, so much gold that it actually depresses the price of gold in Egypt as he sort of makes his way to Saudi Arabia. And then on the other side, the Ming Dynasty traveling to Africa, they found pottery from the Ming Dynasty on the Swahili coast in East Africa. So huge amount of relationships that had predated the 19th century, where you see this uptick in imperialism, right? Where you're looking for markets, you're looking for slaves, you're looking for raw material, and a whole bunch of nationalism that culminates really in 1885. The conquest of the continent doesn't happen in 1885, but this is sort of the last sort of stage of it. And it's driven to try to come with, as you said, rules of the road. It's also about making sure that a couple of countries get their, this is what the King of Belgium called it, a piece of that magnificent pie.
He wanted it for himself, right?
Yeah, so they divide up the continent, and mostly that's France and Britain. The Germans get a couple of colonies, modern-day Namibia, modern-day Tanzania, without the island of Zanzibar, Rwanda, and Burundi. You get Spain, which gets Equatorial Guinea, and Portugal, which had actually had been there almost the longest, but they have 5 colonies. And so they set out these new markers, which divides communities and people and language groups and religion. If you look at the continent, most socioeconomic livelihoods, all of that is actually horizontal, right? Like bands, climate bands. So similar people doing similar things, and that's how empires, they move from east to west, particularly when you're talking about West Africa, East Africa, North Africa. But the Europeans colonize at the coast first. So they're building colonies that are going vertical. And so just by going vertical, you are bringing in a huge set of diverse people. So in Nigeria, for example, you have 250 different ethnic groups. There's a couple of countries that are homogenous, largely one ethnic group or largely one religion, but most of them have multiple ones. Only 2 countries are not colonized. That's Liberia, where the U.S. sends freed slaves, and Ethiopia. And, 1885, the Berlin Conference sets largely in cement what will be the shape of Africa even after independence. And only 2 countries have had succession, new states being created, that's South Sudan and Eritrea. And a lot of that actually mirrors even decisions that were made in 1885 and in the 19th century.
As I was reading, I stumbled across this 2011 study. It was by professors at Harvard and NYU called Artificial States. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not, but
they basically, and this goes along with what you're talking about. They did an assessment of, like, in the world, what are the most artificially drawn borders, and found, I think it was like 9 out of the 13 most artificial borders in the world are in Africa, and it kind of analyzed the challenges in government development, social cohesion that have happened because of the just crazy borders that were formed, and how they split different ethnic groups and languages, and how that kind of sowed the seeds of conflict that came later.
Yeah, that's a well-known thesis. The other one that you didn't mention, but it's important, is some of these states are so large, Congo, Mali, that there's really a tyranny of distance in terms of just being able to project power and do the basic things that a state does. So that's also a consequence of the way in which these states were formed in the colonial period. There's a famous book by Professor Jeffrey Herbst called Power and State in Africa, which really looks at how was pre-colonial power dispensed, and often it was in much smaller states where you could at least have some authority, de facto authority over that community, and maybe you had states that would maybe have some level of indirect relationship where they paid taxes or they paid alms, but states were much smaller because it was much easier to be, even if it's not ethnically or religiously homogenous, but to project power.
But that's a pain in the ass if you're a colonial power and you're trying to control vast portions of land and extract economic resources, because you don't want to have to negotiate with each individual clan and area. So that's right. Isn't that what happened? That the colonial powers were like, hey, if we group them together in huge countries and put somebody over them, give them a bunch of weapons and allow them to rule this, it would make it easier for us to exploit resources.
Yeah, almost all of these states are governed by the Brits and the French in particular, with skeleton crews. And what the Brits do in particular is something called indirect rule. So in Nigeria, a country which I know really well, there was first a caliphate and then a sultanate, right? Religious leaders who controlled vast parts of northern Nigeria, and they just ended up reporting to the Brits. So you could have only a couple of Brits, and then the traditional leaders would be able to govern as they had been, except now they're collecting taxes or they're following through on whatever the Brits have asked for in terms of particular raw materials. And in places where that didn't exist, where there wasn't sort of natural empires or big states, the Brits would create what they called warrant chiefs. So they would say to someone, this happened in parts of the southeast, I should say, you're now in charge and we are now going to govern through you. The French were a little more in terms of indirect rule, but again, they came up with all of these systems to how to manage this large population in this large area that I think had consequences for how governance was thought about. Extractive, not much of a connection to the people, and I think we're living with some of that today.
What do you think about the role of religion in shaping modern Africa? The North is mostly Muslim due to Arab Muslim conquest from the Middle East in, what's the 7th century or something. South majority Christian due to, I guess, mainly colonialism, although I think there was a long running Christian population in Ethiopia.
Right?
How important, if you're going to say, I want to understand Africa, is understanding that divide? Because, what I've gathered is that there's been more tension along the center of the country where those two religions mix more. Is that too generalized, or is that a fair way to broadly understand some of the conflicts that have happened in Africa?
I think religion is an important cleavage, but it's largely because it comes together with other identity markers and other ways of livelihood and organization of your society. The reason why the Muslim conversions kind of stopped really along a particular latitude is because you couldn't bring cattle further south because of the tsetse fly, right? So the entire economy of Muslim life, there was a sort of a natural geographic barrier to that, right? I just talked about why it didn't make sense to build states vertical and not horizontal. But the point here is that being Muslim or being Christian also corresponds sometimes, although that's changed over the years, with are you a pastoralist society or an agrarian society, right? How do you organize your life due to the climate and the topography? And yes, people do instrumentalize religion and do a lot of othering with it, but sometimes that has to do with more economic reasons, and sometimes over time it can be bigger than that. So I guess the answer is always it depends, but it is an important facet, and the thing that one should always approach these kind of questions is avoid the simplistic framing, but not reject it either. Understand that religion is a part of the conversation and part of the story. Africans are one of the most religious people in the world, whereas the rest of the world is becoming more and more secular. Pentecostalism is actually growing in leaps and bounds on the continent. So there's a real dynamicism with religion on the continent, but it is one factor, and it's often the way that factor and other dynamics come together that lead to tension or conflict, or very different views about policy and culture.
Can we go back to this thing you mentioned about the tsetse fly? Expand on that. I feel like that's something super interesting to understand about like geography and demographics.
So the tsetse fly is what's responsible for sleeping sickness. So if a cattle is stung by the tsetse fly, then they get sleeping sickness and they die. And so if the basis of we're really talking here again about West Africa, if the basis of your entire economy is pastoralism and cattle, and you start moving into a wetter, more tropical climate, so you're moving out of the Sahel, out of the desert, out of the savanna, into a more, as I said, wetter, humid area, you get more tsetse fly, and you can't actually then, have your pastoralists. Now, one of the reasons why in Nigeria we're seeing more and more problems between Muslim farmers and Muslim herders and Christian farmers is this climate change is actually changing your ability and where you can go. So you're seeing more and more pastoralists moving further and further south in ways they couldn't do it in the 16th, 17th, 18th century.
Interesting. So I wanted to get a little bit into your career. You've worked on Africa policy across several administrations, from Obama to Trump 1 to Biden. What has been the difference in approaches to Africa policy during the time that you worked in government?
Well, Africa policy has been largely consistent since the end of the Cold War, really starting in the latter years of President Clinton's administration. In fact, we talk about sort of glowingly about a bipartisan consensus. And what's unique about the commonalities, before I get into the differences, is that each of these administrations have launched their own programs, their own signature initiatives. So under Clinton, it was the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is a bipartisan legislation that allows for unilateral trade preferences, meaning African countries can export to the United States without tariffs. That was embraced by Bush and onward and onward and onward until now, which we'll get to. And then Bush comes in and has PEPFAR, which is his big AIDS HIV program. It's one of the most successful programs ever. 25 million people are living because of PEPFAR, but also the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which does investments. And those then are embraced by Obama, who does Power Africa, which is focusing on how do we improve electricity. And then even under Trump comes up with Prosper Africa, and when we were in the Biden administration, we embraced that as well. So what's unique about Africa is that we, until very recently, were building on each other. There's always little differences here, right? Like, how do you think about reproductive rights and programming around it does change between Democrat and Republican. Maybe there's more of an emphasis on counterterrorism. I mean, initially, obviously, with the Bush administration and the Obama administration, by the Trump administration and the Biden administration, counterterrorism is not as heavily emphasized as it was in the previous two administrations. Some of that is, again, partisan or political ideology. Some of that's just lessons learned and a changing sort of national sentiment about that. We're in a moment now, and it really did start under the administration that I was the senior director for Africa, meaning that I was the president's advisor for all Africa policy at the White House, and now under Trump, where a different consensus was forming, essentially that what we had been doing for the last 25 years was great, or at least I believed it was great, but the world had changed so dramatically, and the continent had changed so dramatically, that we needed to rethink what we were doing. And so there was a lot of questioning about how do we move programs and policies to be more purpose fit for the challenges of the 21st century. And that's in particular where you're seeing an international system being dismantled and a new one yet being formed. Trump team's coming in with a wholly different view. Same maybe instinct about we should be doing things differently, but the dismantling of USAID or the end of visas for students, the closure of MCC, potentially the closure of the Africa Command. I mean, these are radical changes to what we've been doing for 25 years with a lot of success.
I want to get more into the impact of that here in a second, but this kind of ties into this article that you recently wrote about assessing the level of engagement in Africa by like FaceTime with the president. And it's interesting. It seems to be like going down over time, where you have like the Bushes, JFK, Carter gave African leaders a lot of FaceTime, whereas Clinton, Obama, Trump, Biden gave less. Why is like FaceTime with African leaders an important way to gauge engagement? So
one of my closest friends and my boss now at Kupanda Capital was President Bush's senior director for Africa. And so he and I are always debating which is the best president on Africa. It's a very small group of people who play this game, but he and I will often talk about that, and I will point to Kennedy and he'll point to President Bush. And we would trade statistics, and one of them that we kept talking about was how many times an African was in the Oval Office. And we decided that we would, one, count all of the engagements every single U.S. president since Kennedy has had with both Africans and non-Africans. And then two, come up with a thesis, which I think is right, which is the point of this article, is that when a president spends time with an African leader, first of all, the whole system is trying to do things, right? Like, what are the deliverables for this meeting? What policies are we going to push? What conversations do we need to have? But as time goes on, the president often is having a greater understanding of what are the challenges in Africa and how the U.S. can play a role. So I'll give you this example of PEPFAR. So President Bush, first of all, met with more Africans than any other U.S. president. It was 3% of his total working days that he spent with Africans. But by the time he announces the PEPFAR programs, and he does that at a State of the Union 2 years into his term, he'd already met with 14 African leaders. So that was more than Trump or Biden did in their entire collective 8 years. What I thought was really interesting, Drew, about the exercise that surprised me is that, with the exception of President Bush, President George W. Bush, every single Cold War president met with more Africans than every single post-Cold War president. I thought the numbers for Clinton, for example, were going to be much better because he really does sort of change the way he thinks about Africa in '94, after the Rwandan genocide, after Black Hawk Down, there's a lot of instability in West Africa, and he's really a driver for AGOA. But it was only 5% of his total, 5% of every single foreign leader he met with was African. It was really low. Only Trump is lower than that. So it does tell you something else, right? So one, it tells you that when you're meeting with a lot of African leaders, when you're having FaceTime, as you said, you're generating new programs. You're telling the bureaucracy that Africa is important. You're probably also integrating Africa into some of the biggest important conversations in the globe that we're facing globally. But more and more in these recent couple of years, with a bipartisan consensus, Africa has been falling off the radar, that more and more administrations just didn't see why Africa matters to the global priorities of the U.S. administration. And I knew that in some respects. I'd written an article about how do we, in foreign affairs, about bringing Africans into the conversation. That was the whole point of the Africa strategy. But there it was in black and white with those numbers.
The foreign policy of George W. Bush often gets dragged these days, prominently because of what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. But he had a profound impact on Africa, not only producing one of the all-time great meme videos of all time, but also, obviously saving so many lives. Can you just talk about the profound impact George W. Bush had on the continent of Africa?
Yeah, it's really incredible, and there often is sort of there are very, very critical views about some of his policy, but those of us who work on Africa know that his legacy, his commitment to the continent, became so deep. And it didn't start that way. In fact, I read an interview with him just a couple weeks ago where he gets elected and Condoleezza Rice says, "Hey, you're going to be doing a lot on Africa." And he's like, "I am? Oh, okay. Like, I don't know much about Africa. I only know the stereotypes." But she and the entire administration, and because President Bush, as I said, engaged with so many Africans, he really, he changed so much of our policy, training over 60,000 African soldiers to be peacekeepers, creating the Africa Command, PEPFAR that we talked about, Millennium Challenge Corporation. And when he would meet with African leaders, he would talk about everything. I mean, all the global issues. He met with President Museveni of Uganda, and they talked about insurgencies and counterinsurgencies in Iraq. And his answer was, well, this guy led an insurgency, so he's going to have some insights for me to think about what we're doing in the Middle East. And to this day, George Bush is the most popular U.S. president in Africa. I mean, the memory of Kennedy is faded, but he's the most popular president. You can find George W. Bush streets all over the continent. And it's what I have been told, that if someone asks him about his most important foreign policy legacy, he points to Africa. So it's really a high water mark for our policies. And it all comes down to this one factor, that a president has to care about engaging in Africa. Because, Drew, if you ask the bureaucracy, hey, what's the formula to figure out like how important Africa is, it's always going to end up in a very low number. And it takes a president, maybe in a Secretary of State, maybe a National Security Advisor, to say, I don't care what your math says, we are doing this. And that's what President Bush did again and again and again.
Can you just briefly allow people to understand the importance of PEPFAR and what it was?
Yeah. So
And maybe just a little set the stage a little bit for like the problem that existed at the time.
yeah. AIDS epidemic was running rampant in Africa. In some places, particularly in southern Africa, we're talking about 25 to 1/3 of the population with AIDS, HIV, and it. The only way to stabilize that to ensure that not hundreds and millions of people die from AIDS, but also that these countries fail because of the intensity of this virus and this epidemic. I mean, South Africa's military was full of people with AIDS, HIV. I mean, like, it was affecting everything in society. And so, he made a multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar, by the end of it, commitment to deliver antiretrovirals to the continent, to help with building health sectors and working with ministries. And as I said, like, the top line is that 25 million people in Africa have been able to live with AIDS, HIV. I mean, that's how many people it's essentially saved. It's a remarkable program, bipartisan. At least it has been bipartisan for a very long time, and really changed lives. It's incredible. And that was a big chunk of the national treasury to put it towards Africa. And he did it with aplomb, and he did it with a seriousness and a conviction about how critical it would be to do this.
So when you're working in government, you're essentially an intelligence officer. You end up at the National Intelligence Council. Eventually, you're again a close advisor to President Biden. What is the job of intelligence, and how do you go about gathering and analyzing that? From the outside, it just seems like something that would be such a daunting task and difficult to be able to summarize so many different inputs coming in and being able to come up with a coherent direction for the president.
Yeah, I think of myself more as an analyst than as a policymaker, because I joined the CIA when I was 23 years old, and spent 16 years in the intelligence community working exclusively on Africa. The job is to take a huge amount of information and try to synthesize it, try to figure out what pieces fit, what pieces don't fit. And that can be everything from what you're reading in the press, to conversations that you're having, to clandestine reporting, to signals intelligence, to imagery. And you take all of this data and information, and you work really hard with colleagues to stress test and identify assumptions and think about alternative futures. And ultimately, you take this, what we would call raw reporting or raw intelligence, and you write a report that goes to the president or it goes to senior policymakers that says, in country X or at issue Y, our view is it is moving in this direction, and this will have these implications for the U.S. government and the U.S. people. And that becomes often a driver of policy. Every policy meeting, and when I was the National Intelligence Officer for Africa, I did this. Every single policy meeting, it starts with an intelligence brief. So it's objective. It is not about making the current administration's policies look good. It is, here's what we are seeing in Sudan. Here is how we understand the threat of terrorism in the Sahel. And then policymakers, and now when I became a policymaker, then you start, hitting State Department, hitting DOD, hitting others and saying, okay, well, what are we doing about the challenge that we just heard about? What resources do we have to bring to bear? What's our diplomatic strategy? But the intelligence community, it's dedicated analysts and collectors, but I was an analyst, who are trying to get the best information possible to manage the uncertainty of a world that's chaotic and complex, and then bring that to a policymaker so they can make better decisions, right? The answer is always, we're trying to inform policymaking. We're trying to help them have as much information as possible to make the best decisions for the U.S. people.
I don't know what kind of nerd it makes me, but that sounds so fun.
It was the best job I ever had, honestly. I love it. And I teach a class at George Washington University on the history of intelligence analysis in Africa. I have thousands of declassified reports that my predecessors many decades ago have written. I love it. And it's still who I am today. As I said, like I spent a lot more time trying to understand and enjoying like what's happening in a country and where it's going than necessarily always coming up with the remedies or the recommendations. And that's a big distinction, by the way, between policymaking and analysis, is that analysts don't make recommendations. They don't say, you should do X, right? You don't do what we call policy prescription. Your job is to, again, present. It's not different exactly from journalism, right, Drew? It's how do I help you understand what is happening and where it may go and what the implications were, and over to you, policymaker, to make the hard decision.
It struck me that you started in the Obama administration around the same time as the Belt and Road Initiative was launched. This is a Chinese global infrastructure and development strategy that has led to a lot of Chinese investment in the continent of Africa. I think I saw where trade between the country and the continent was 10 billion in 2000, and it's now over 200 billion. China's full force entry into Africa has had what impact on what you've been analyzing?
Yeah, hugely. So I joined the U.S. government as an intern on September 11th under the Bush administration, and then became a full-time CIA analyst in 2003. And then this moment that you're talking about in the Obama administration, most of the National Security Council, I'm just doing this so people understand the trajectory, but most people that work in the National Security Council aren't political appointees, they're detailees. So under the Obama administration, I was a CIA detailee to the Obama administration. So I was playing the role of a policymaker during that period. And then later on, when I worked for Biden, I was a political appointee, but just so you have that sense. When I started working on the continent and working in analysis, China was something that we talked about, but it wasn't viewed as the dominant competitor. There were actually other countries, including some of our allies, who were more concerned about getting the trade deals, having undue influence than necessarily the Chinese. Although you can go back in the declassified record and find these pieces about what is China up to in Africa, or who's winning more support, Taipei or Beijing. But in 2009, China surpasses the United States as the key trading partner for Africa. And we start being more and more focused in understanding what China is doing on the continent. Some of it's very good for Africans, and some of it is not very good for Africans, and some of it is not very good for our interests. And it's really important to kind of think about it in those ways, right? What are the threats to the United States? What are the threats that undermine African sovereignty? And what are projects and programs, building roads, for example, that are probably positive as long as they're done in a way that's, respectful of labor, the free, fair in terms of how they won the bidding, environmentally, not damaging. But all of this kind of gets messed up. But what we were soon understanding is that through the Belt and Road Initiative, China is trying to stitch together the world in a way that redounds to Beijing's favor. That means to be able to project power, like build a military base in Djibouti. That means winning the favor of Africans through these large infrastructure programs. That means working very diligently in the UN Security Council and in the General Assembly so that they can marshal African votes. Africa is the largest regional bloc in the UN system. If you have African votes, you're in a pretty good place. Africa always has 3 of the 15 Security Council seats. So, it became apparent that as China was rising, that they understood both the economic, political, and security benefits of having a strong relationship with the continent. And in many cases, not all, but in many cases, that was at our expense. And so then you have to kind of rethink the way that you have to incorporate that into your analysis, and then rethink the way that you're doing policy. And it's difficult. We can here in Washington be as hawkish as we want on China. The reality is that doesn't make a lot of sense on the continent when China is as popular as the United States is, and China's the one building the roads, and we're not. AIDS, HIV, and PEPFAR are deeply appreciated, but that's been factored into the system because it's been going on for 20 years. And so it is an extraordinary challenge, but the worst thing that we could do is not understand the various facets of it. What is a real threat? What is beneficial if done in a competitive way? And how do Africans think about us and the Chinese in a nuanced way?
You've written about the struggle when you're in an administration of deciding when to meet, when to not, who to platform, who to not. And that struck me as a really interesting situation that you have to go through working with the president. And it goes even as far as when you do go to a conference, where are they going to stand? Could they be pictured with someone? What would the ramifications be of a picture of that being seen by the public? Is it better to engage with somebody because you develop a relationship and let them know your values and what you want? Or is the platform of somebody that, participated in a coup ultimately detrimental to the continent as a whole? Can you just talk about the challenge of navigating those situations?
Yeah, I've been publishing this Substack called Post Strategy in the last couple weeks because I have a lot of work that I'm trying to do as I think about my time, and also bring in the history of U.S. policy towards Africa. But I'm really trying to figure out what worked and what didn't work, and what are the ways in which we do things that we should really change, and maybe what are things that we're doing that are great and we should continue to do. And so this recent article was about engagement, which I spent more time in the most annoying meetings about this question of who meets whom than maybe anything else. And everyone came to the table with, if we don't do it, China will and Russia will, or we can't do this because Congress will be upset at us. I mean, it was predictable, but it didn't make it any less frustrating. And I was surprised, Drew, I wrote this in the article, that even though I wrote in the Africa strategy, President Biden's Africa strategy, that we should meet, sometimes I didn't always go for engagement because I started worried about what the loudest voices would say about who sat next to who, right? And what is clear to me in retrospect is that what matters is if you're going to get something done. And I don't know how you get things done if you're not engaging, right? If you're not, we've had the same policy on Zimbabwe for 20 years where we put sanctions on them and never meet with them, and it's still under a dictatorship, and the people of Zimbabwe are still suffering. Maybe we need to relook at that. We're not going to find a way forward unless we engage. Now, if we are going to engage, we should be very clear about what we're trying to do. We should be talking about it out loud. And maybe this is a place where we borrow from the rest of the world. I think that U.S.-Africa space is a little special snowflake where you can live out your fantasies of what a pristine policy looks like, where we only talk to the countries that we love the most, and we platform them, and we call them darlings and models, which almost never holds to the test of time. Whereas in the rest of the world, yeah, there are real problems engaging with Saudi Arabia or UAE, but we do it. I remember John Feiner, who was the Deputy National Security Advisor under President Biden, this was before I came in the administration, did an interview, and they were asking why President Biden called Putin. And he said, it's a consequential relationship. Of course we're going to engage. So if you want to have a serious Africa policy, you've got to cut out the nonsense that Africa policy is just about crowning victors who you think in that moment represent, certain values or certain accomplishments. You've got to talk to people. And so that was my big takeaway from that piece is, in most cases we should engage. We should be very clear about what we're doing. It's a more mature relationship to engage about things you disagree with, and it's the best pathway in theory to get towards a solution that works better for the U.S. interest.
Last summer, you wrote an article in Foreign Affairs where you called for more American engagement in the continent, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. You wrote that there's a crisis reminiscent of what happened in the chaos that followed the fall of the Soviet Union. Can you explain why you say that and the dangers that lie ahead for the continent?
Yeah, I was at my desk. I have this job that I've wanted to have my whole life, which is being the Senior Director for Africa of the National Security Council. And I'm at my desk, and there was a coup in Gabon earlier that morning. There had been a coup in July in Niger. and then the outbreak of the Sunni civil war in April. I thought to myself, is this the worst it's ever been? How come it's me that has to be here for this? And that led me on a little bit of a journey to think about, okay, well, what was the most difficult time that the continent's had? And I went back to really the end of the Cold War, which sometimes in Washington and in the public memory, we think about the fall of the Berlin Wall and how great that was and the end of the Soviet Union. And even in Africa with the end of apartheid, but it was actually a quite violent moment. You see the wars in Congo, the Rwandan genocide, Black Hawk Down in Somalia, and in that moment, Clinton writes a letter. Clinton reads this article called "The Coming Anarchy" by Robert Kaplan, and it's a very dystopic vision of what Africa is going to look like. And he sends a note to Don Steinberg, who ended up being my predecessor, many removed, and he said, is this true? And Steinberg came back and essentially said, if we don't do anything, it will be true. Right? He had this whole quote from A Christmas Carol, and he says, if the courses be departed from, the ends will change. And that launches a totally different Africa policy, the one that we had been talking about earlier, what it eventually became the bipartisan consensus, which largely had been the last 30 years of more trade, more investment in security, more investment in development and health, more engagement, at least under President Bush. And if you think about that moment and you think about today, the most important commonality is one international system had started to crumble and a new one had not yet formed. And that's why I think there's so much volatility right now on the continent. And the only way through it is greater engagement, greater investment, greater seriousness about the importance of Africa, coupled with just what we're doing globally too, or what we should be doing globally, which is trying to find out what the new rules of the roads and the norms are. And then on the African side, it's not in the article, but I think we need more African leadership and African ideas about the future. But that's, for me, this moment that is so important, is that we need to recognize where we are and recognize that the way that we were able to deliver, I think, major benefits for Africans and the United States came out of a strong vision by multiple presidents that this is worth time and energy, and it is only going to get better if the U.S. leads.
What do you think the impact of Donald Trump's reelection has been on the continent? Has there been a withdrawal from the region? I mean, certainly with the dismantling of USAID, it's now been moved under State Department. Maybe you have some thoughts on whether that's an effective strategy. But broadly speaking, so far, what has been the impact of Trump?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a significant withdrawal for the United States, right? So most of our embassies are half USAID. Half of USAID's funding, out of the 40 billion, 20 billion of that goes to Africa. So immediately you're talking about people will suffer and die because we're not doing it. Now, we can have a conversation about what we should be doing and were we doing it the right way, fine. But you're seeing the end of aid. You are seeing the end of major foreign assistance programs like the Millennium Challenge Corporation that built infrastructure, that built ports, that built roads, that did water and sanitation, that did urban renewal in Nairobi, for example. That's gone. The tariffs under President Trump, some of the smallest countries in the world in Africa have the largest tariffs. The small country of Lesotho, which is surrounded, it's totally landlocked, surrounded by South Africa, has a 50% tariff. It has a 50% tariff in part because more than any other country, it took advantage of AGOA and exports apparel to the United States, and so there was a huge trade balance. I don't know what they are going to be able to do to not have such a debilitating tariff. They're talking about the end of visas. That's an important way in which we have soft power is by bringing African students to the United States, including President Obama's father. Right? He came to study in the United States. That's how he got President Obama's father met his mother, and he became
Without this, we wouldn't have had President Obama, is what you're saying.
We would have had President Obama. And And I think most Africans are trying to figure out like what this means. What does it mean when you have multi-decade relationship with the United States that is withering rapidly, and in some cases being quite, I mean, I'm going to say it, like hateful, right? I mean, these are really callous decisions that they are making. And everyone, yeah.
Secretary of State Rubio says they're just moving it under State Department, getting rid of the woke stuff, and they're going to still do all this same work. How dare you question our commitment to all these things?
None of the facts on the ground support that. There are trucks or tanks, actually shipping tanks of wheat that are outside of Sudan in the Red Sea that can't be delivered because they can't, they're not even able, because they've destroyed USAID, they can't even process payments. A lot of the life saving that they're talking about isn't happening. There's just not the evidence that that is true. That's not to say that some parts of aid and foreign assistance won't be renewed or continued, but at a much smaller degree. And in the short term, at least, a number of people are going to suffer. So, I think I just don't think the facts on the ground support that. And I talk to a lot of Africans. There's a story, again, Lesotho, which is the country, if you recall, that President Trump at the State of the Union says no one's ever even heard of this country. But we just closed down a massive investment in a chicken farm, right, in poultry, because we're getting rid of the Millennium Challenge Corporation. So there's all of these real-time effects. And most African governments that I know are trying to make the best of it. They have to. Many African intellectuals are trying to see the positive of it, less aid dependency. But even if you believe in a rosier future, which it's hard to believe, you can't deny that the immediate present is going to be quite damaging, and our role in the perception of us is going to be weakened. Africa is the one region that is the most favorable of the United States, right? So if you look at the Gallup poll from last year, there's more goodwill towards the United States in Africa than in any other region in the world. And it just seems difficult to imagine that will stay constant.
Has the U.S. lost moral authority and even practical ability to pressure African leaders to abide by democratic norms? I mean, you mentioned pulling the rug out from under the continent on so many crucial programs. And then, let's just say it. Trump tried to overturn a free and fair election. He's been, kind of ignoring court orders, flirting with the idea of remaining in power. I don't even know if the administration cares to pressure these countries to follow democratic norms, but has the U.S. lost the ability to even bring that subject up?
I think we're going to find out. I don't really know. One can be cynical and one can point out hypocrisy. But right now, the U.S. government, the U.S. Embassy in Dar es Salaam is pointing out and talking with regularity about abductions of Kenyan activists and crackdowns on the opposition. And so some of it's still happening. It's going to be context specific. We still have a loud megaphone. And yes, people can be cynical about it. But I'm not sure yet how much of our moral authority that we have lost. And I would be also being disingenuous to say that this isn't new either. I studied in Cape Town, as I told you, and so when I was there, it was in 2000 during the Bush-Gore election. And I remember South African friends saying to me, "Oh, you're the greatest democracy in the world. You don't even know who won the election. It's got to go to the Supreme Court." So people are always going to be quick to pick up on our hypocrisy. In the Biden administration, we tried to be less hypocritical. We really tried to be more humble. And I think some people thought that was a talking point. I never did. I thought that it was a much better place to say, like, we've got some real problems. We're working on it. You actually have some things that we can learn from. For example, in West Africa, after the civil wars in Liberia, they did a phenomenal job in trying to how to rehabilitate and reintegrate militias. That could have been something that we could have learned from with our own challenges in the United States. or in South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I liked being in a place where we were saying that you shouldn't just emulate us, but we have a lot to share, and you have a lot to share, and we're all sort of collectively working to better our societies.
You've written about the importance of human geography in making national security decisions, that the traditional models of assessing intelligence, focusing on like military capabilities and political actors, have failed to produce like the type of intelligence needed to make sound decisions. What is human geography, and how can we better assess what's happening on the ground in countries that are far away and complex, and relay that to policy decision makers so that they can make good decisions?
Yeah, human geography. Thank you for asking that question. Human geography is it's a new discipline. It's different than political science or economics, but it's trying to understand how people live, in their communities but from a distance, and that's really enabled by machine learning and AI. So I'm on the board of a company called Frame, and what Frame does is that we're trying to put together the best principles of human geography, but through survey data and polling, massive amount of polling, massive amount of survey data that had once been produced by USAID, produced by World Bank, or produced by local census bureaus. You can put all of this data together, and then you can replicate it across a country or a region, so that at the 1 square kilometer, you don't know what one person thinks, but at the 1 square kilometer, at the neighborhood level, you know what their behaviors are, what their activities are, and their attributes and their beliefs. And what it allows for is, to go back to where we started, the diversity of the continent or the diversity of the world unpacked. So now you have real granular context about a community, and whether or not they have generators for their house for electricity, and how many of them are on Facebook, and what do they think about the current state of the world. And so you can imagine that having this kind of big data at your fingertips and being able to understand the world allows you to make better decisions. And so it's a remarkable tool and a remarkable technology, and it gets us away from sending anthropologists into the middle of nowhere in a war zone, which is what DoD used to do, to great criticism. But it's a safer and more ethical way, because you're getting the nuance and at a very granular level about people, but you're not making individual information available. And for targeting, and you're not putting people in harm's way, but you're getting this really this tapestry of how people think and how they live, and ultimately that is the sort of the key ingredient for good decisions.
I imagine that information would not only be highly valuable to people that are trying to make good decisions, but also people that are trying to make nefarious decisions. How important in this broader power struggle in Africa, where you have actors like China, Russia, the United States, all searching for influence, vying for influence, access to that type of information seems like it could be manipulated in all different kind of ways.
Well, look, information is power, and whoever has it can wield it. What I think about this technology, I actually think it's very applicable to counter Russia and counter China, to understand where there is disinformation, and to understand where it is particular themes or messages are getting resonance. And then how do you build resiliency to disinformation and misinformation? So not only is it gives you an accurate picture of what is happening on the ground, but it also gives you the breadcrumbs on what one may or should do to try to challenge or to inoculate or defend against propaganda.
Who are the customers? Like, is that something that you sell to governments, NGOs? Could Coca-Cola buy it?
We've anyone could buy it in theory. We've been on a journey. We have found a lot of support for our work with, for example, the Gates Foundation. Commercial companies haven't been. We've worked with a number of commercial companies over time, but I really think philanthropy.
You mentioned South Africa earlier. I wonder what you make of the Oval Office meeting between President Trump and the South African president, the President Trump and the administration bringing in these white refugees. What do you think about that, and how do you think the continent reacts to that type of favoritism?
Yeah, South Africa is in a bind, in part because the president of the United States is trafficking in these falsehoods that he clearly believes is happening. There's lots of bigger conversations.
Says he believes is happening. I don't know what
Says
he
he
really.
believes is happening, but certainly has not stopped saying it, and he's been saying it for years. He said it in the first term. And, there's a number of things that there are foreign policy disagreements with South Africa, to be sure. But they were not able to get any access to the president. One of their ambassadors was kicked out. Another envoy never got a meeting. And so Ramaphosa really did this high wire act to get into the Oval to engage the president. And I guess we'll see if they get what they want, which the South Africans want a dialogue. They would like to figure out how to deal and have a trade relationship. They would like to host President Trump at the G20, which they're the chair of this year, before the U.S. takes over in 2026. But to do that, there was this terrible ambush, and the South Africans had to sit there and listen to it. Now, I understand that the off-camera conversations were much more productive, but it was pretty disheartening to see. You can respect the stoicism of the South Africans, but that tells people that if you're going to go to the Oval Office, you're going to have to be, supplicant. There was a statement from the president of Ghana 2 days ago, so late May, where he sort of said this was an embarrassment, the way that President Trump treated the South Africans. So I think the implications of that meeting have yet to unfold, but I was sick to my stomach watching it. I was really disheartened.
I wonder, though, if it's all just kind of a show, similar to what we saw with Zelensky, like the price you have to pay to come get a deal with the U.S. and have a dialogue is we got to put on this show for the cameras, and I'm going to dress you down and look powerful.
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly right. And then you have to decide if that's worth it. So you have to ask yourself, over time, do global peers, want to be part of this circus and have to come off and have to be berated in the case of Zelensky, or have to be exposed to a slideshow, essentially a video of falsehoods about genocide in South Africa, and if that's worth it? And it may be an accelerant, right? So it's the rhetorical accelerant to the programmatic fact, right? We're already dismantling all of our aid programs, and now the relationships, at least on camera, have to be so asymmetric and oftentimes cruel. And is that worth it? And does that push you just to build relationships with other countries?
What about the underlying issue that Trump is talking about there, where you have a relatively small amount of white farmers that are the remnants of colonialism in Africa who own large portions of land and are relatively more wealthy than their black African counterparts?
Well, look, there are some facts here that 70% of farmland is still in the hands of farmers. South Africa has a willing buyer, willing seller program that they've been doing since '94. There hasn't been as much upkeep as they want. And South Africa is a very violent, or uptake, I should say, as they want. And South Africa is a very violent place. So yes, white farmers have been attacked. That pales in comparison to the amount of black South Africans who are terrorized and who are exposed to crime and criminality. So South Africa has some real big problems that they not only have not been able to address, but I think has gotten worse in the 30 years since the end of apartheid. So that is fundamentally what South Africa needs to deal with. But in general, white South Africans, I mean, by leaps and bounds, live better lives than black South Africans. Leaps and bounds. I mean, it's not even a question of the different kind of access and opportunities that they have versus the majority of black South Africans 30 years after the end of apartheid.
And you could understand why that would be extremely frustrating to the black majority, because this is a vestige of colonialism.
Right. Well, and then let's look at this from a global perspective, or at least a global South perspective. We've declared that there's a genocide. We, the U.S. government, not one individual, has declared that there's a genocide in Sudan, and we know of significant conflict and civil wars in other parts of the continent. But the only group of people who have been afforded refugee status are white Afrikaners. We've decided to close the doors for everyone except for this one group.
I wanted to have some more time to talk about positive prospects for the future of Africa. It's the world's youngest population. The median age is around like 20 years old, I think, whereas in the US, it's around US and Europe, it's around 40, even higher in parts of Asia. Japan, I think, is closer to 50. Over the next 100 years, do you think that provides a distinct advantage to Africa? And what would be the determining factor if it's able to capitalize?
Yeah, Africa's demographic dividend is pretty significant, and I think that the world will be African. I mean, that's not a stretch. For example, Nigeria is going to surpass the United States as the third most populous country in the world by, I think, 2045. And I think you said, right, one out of every 4 people in the world will be African by 2050. So that is a huge benefit, especially while the rest of the world is aging and graying, a massive labor force, a continent that has a really strong record of innovation. But the biggest determinant if it's going to be successful or not is creating opportunities, right? Creating jobs and growing their economy so that the human capital of Africans, the ingenuity, is put to good use. And it's going to be challenging because the amount of investment that is required in infrastructure, in education, is substantial. We do need programs and an effort globally to address this, because either we will all benefit from this demographic boom or we will all suffer for it.
Do you think Africa will rise in economic and military power as other populations age and Africa has more workers that are able to drive those type of gains?
Maybe. Again, I think that it's going to be about the policy decisions they make now. I don't know if that will be the case if they don't start really modernizing their economies and creating opportunities. So, you can imagine a scenario that is quite positive, and you can imagine a scenario that is quite negative. And to go back to Charles Dickens and A Christmas Carol, if the means change, so will the ends.
Have a few just kind of weird things I wanted to bring up and get your reaction. If you don't have anything to say about it, I'll cut it out.
Yeah.
The first one was, I was recently in Uganda, and one of the things I found most interesting. So I had been just reading a little bit of Ugandan history going into it, and obviously Idi Amin is one of the more important modern Ugandan figures, and you read about what a brutal dictator he was, how many people he killed, but when I got to Uganda, I was so struck that everybody I talked to had nice things to say about him, that he was this figure to be revered, and he kept the trains running, and he kicked the Indians out. Does that say anything? Maybe it's all of humanity in the short memory that we all have, but I don't know. I guess what do you think about that? And have you noticed that phenomenon in other places in Africa and even, I guess, in across the world?
Yeah, I think memory is not very trustworthy. And if the average age of the continent is 19 or 20, how many people experience Idi Amin's reign. But I had the same experience when I was in Nigeria, where there was a conversation about what life was like under the dictator Sani Abacha, and how that was better than democracy or the current moment that you have. When President Muhammadu Buhari was elected, so he was a military leader, took power at a coup in '83, and then he was elected in 2015. And many Nigerians were really excited about Buhari. That's not necessarily how they view his tenure today, but they were excited about his return because he is, quote, very harsh, and so that he would, impose discipline. But even look at our own politics, right? Like, make America great again. There's always sort of a distorted sense of what the past was like and how good it was in the past. So I'm not surprised that that was your experience in Uganda. I suspect that if you were in parts of Ethiopia or Sudan or even Chad, where there were pretty horrendous dictators, that you would hear some people who would say that. Not everyone, but some people.
Why did Muammar Gaddafi love Condoleezza Rice so much? There's all these stories about him calling her his black African darling woman. I love her so much. I guess he presented her with all these gifts, including a diamond ring and a locket with his image on it. And then when he was finally overthrown, they went to his palace and he had this whole collection of Condoleezza Rice pictures. What?
I really don't know the story of that. One of the things that I don't like about U.S. Africa policy is that since 1974, we've split North Africa and Southern Africa, or Sub-Saharan Africa. Not to say that I couldn't be reading on that, and not to say that when Gaddafi, I spent a lot of time on the implications of Libya's fall on Sub-Saharan Africa. But it means that for the 5 North African countries, I just never have spent a lot of time digging into it. I'm hoping someone will rectify that one day, because I think it doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's just the reality of our politics.
Can you say anything about the eccentricities of Muammar Gaddafi?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think I can't bring anything new to the conversation about, setting up tents in New York during the UN General Assembly a week, and, his protein guard of women. I mean, I read all the salacious stuff like you have, but I don't know much about it beyond that.
He's a strange guy. Okay, that's really all I have for you. I wanted to give you a chance to let people know how they can read you, how they can follow you, what you're doing these days, and just how people can stay up with your stuff.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. So I launched this Substack called Post Strategy a couple weeks ago, and so I'm posting every 2 weeks, and it's really an effort to think about what worked and what hasn't worked in U.S. policy. So I've talked about many of the things that we've talked about today, about strategies, about the Oval Office, about engagement. I got a lot more to come. And then, I'm on Twitter, but not as much anymore. But I'm at Judd Devermont. Same for Blue Sky. So those are ways you can follow me. And, love the engagement. I love to be told why things aren't working well and what the Biden administration didn't do or why my analysis is wrong. It's the only way we learn.
Awesome. Well, I'll put a link to that Substack in the show description. And I really appreciate it. It's been an interesting conversation. We could probably go all day long, but I think we'll leave it at that. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it.